what you're hesitating about is a change that feels like it's a huge risk. Quitting your job and starting your own thing, right, is a huge risk financially for most people. The question that I encourage people to ask in any situation like that is, what could I do to make this change less risky? Because when you have a situation where the change is less risky, then you're much more likely to do it, right? Because it's not a big deal. It's like, okay, I'm changing a tire, right? Or I'm like, I mean, these are also changes, right? But we don't panic about these things as much. So, like, that's one of the things that I constantly think about.
Con una clara misión de inspirar a otros a ver lo que han perdido de vista y a tener una mente mucho más abierta a las cosas y a las grandes tendencias que están ocurriendo en el mundo, mi invitado hoy dejó una carrera de casi 2 décadas en la industria publicitaria al frente de los equipos de planeación estratégica de grandes grupos como Ogilvy y Leo Burnett para trabajar con cientos de miles de personas hoy, ayudándonos a convertirnos en lo que él les llama los Non-Obvious Thinkers. Yo soy Efraín Mendicuti y he creado este espacio para conversar con algunos de los más destacados líderes de pensamiento, negocios, salud, educación y cultura sobre su trayectoria, experiencias y mejores prácticas para hacer en nuestras vidas de lo cotidiano algo extraordinario. Esto es Entre Mentores DLC. Un comentarista frecuentemente invitado a participar con publicaciones como Harvard Business Review, The Guardian y NPR. Acompáñenme a aprender del autor de Personality Not Included, Likeonomics, Always Eat Left-Handed y la serie de libros anuales de Non-Obvious Trends, que culmina con su más reciente publicación, Non-Obvious Megatrends, el fundador y CEO de The Non-Obvious Company, el extraordinario Rohit Barghava. Rohit, welcome to Entre Mentores DLC.
Muchas gracias. Thank you.
It's great to have you here on the show. I think it's been at least 6 years since we last saw each other at the IAV conference in Mexico City.
Yes, it's been a very long time. I've been back to Mexico since then, but no, we did not connect. So it's been a long time. Yes.
So thank you for making the time. I know that you have a very busy schedule, but I wish we can soon see each other in our protein forms, like Mitch likes to say. No, soon. We'll see. So there are so many things I want to discuss with you today. But before we dive into that, I like to start at the beginning. So why don't you share with us a little about yourself, your history, your trajectory, and basically the path that you walked through to get to where you are in life today?
Sure. Let's start with the small questions and go from there, right? So my journey over the last, I'd say 10 years really has been about building this brand of Non-Obvious, which was sort of inspired by seeing so much media and advice and things out there that are totally obvious, and thinking that there has to be a different way to see things, see the world. And so, as you said in my bio, I spent a lot of time in the advertising world, advertising agencies. And it's basically a field where you get paid to be creative. And if you're going to be super creative, you have to come up with things that nobody else comes up with, right? That's the definition of being creative. And for me, my journey to do that involved coming up with a way of consuming information that nobody else was seeing. And that method that I ended up developing turned into an annual trend report, which then turned into a book, which started to do really well. And it inspired me to then leave the agency world and start my own company over the last 5 years, and really led me on this journey. So for me, it all started with wanting to come up with ideas that weren't obvious and figuring out a way to do that for myself, and then eventually starting a company to teach other people how to do that.
That's really cool. One of the things that I like about that is, often people in any industry, I come from the advertising industry too, as you know. I think I don't know if we were at Leo Burnett at the same time,
but I'm also an ex-Burnetteur or
Okay.
what do you call them? Yeah, Burnetteur.
Yeah,
right?
Burnetteur, yeah.
One of the things that often happen is that there are a lot of people who want to go their own way, and because they realize that precisely because our business in the advertising industry is to create and come up with new ideas, a lot of people often come with great ideas for their clients and the brands that they serve, but not necessarily for their own business. And when they think about what they can do as their life model or their business model for life, they don't know, or we don't know how to execute on that. And you took that leap and you went for it. And how was that process? Like, what steps did you follow, or how do you realize, or when do you realize that it was time for you to move on? Because so far, if I remember correctly, you first wrote Personality Not Included, then Lyconomics,
That's right.
then
both of which while I was at Ogilvy, by the way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So at what point did you decide, so it's time to move forward out of the industry?
So the decision to move forward was actually fairly easy, only because I ran into more and more conflicts where I would be invited, for example, to go and speak at an event like, the event we met at. And at the same time, I had a day job, and speaking at events wasn't really supposed to be part of that day job. And so I started having these conflicts come up. And the more they came up, the more I realized, I could just go and do this speaking and do this on my own. And I think what helped me the most when I took that leap, as you said, and I decided to do that, what helped me the most was having a clear picture of what I didn't want to do. And in my case, I knew that I didn't want to leave the world of agencies and start my own agency. So I had a very clear picture of what I was never going to do, which is start an agency. And that really helped me because, first of all, I didn't waste time trying to do something that I would not have been fulfilled by. But second of all, because I didn't leave the agency world to start an agency, I wasn't competing with the people who I just left. And so as a result, I could start working with them. And in fact, I could start working with anybody who has been in the big agency world knows that there's lots and lots of conflicts. So as soon as you become a Leo Burnett or you're at Ogilvy, you can't work with this brand. You can only work with Coke, but you can't work with Pepsi. You can work with Nestle, but you can't work with, another brand. And I didn't have any of those limitations all of a sudden. And so it became this freeing thing where I could work with any agency. I could come into anything. And I think a week after I left, I landed my first client, which was Under Armour, which I never could have worked with when I was at Ogilvy because we had some conflict client. And that's sort of how it started.
So one of the things about your experience is that you were part of the generation who helped, in a way, transform the advertising industry in your market, because you went from traditional advertising through, the whole digital transformation of the whole industry. I don't like to say going into digital marketing, but rather marketing in a digital world. And you've been part of those transitions, and part of that has been precisely noting these non-obvious trends that are happening. And that's something that's very hard to do for a lot of people. Like, what's a non-obvious trend, and how do you start working on this?
Yeah, so, I'll talk about the non-obvious trends, but just to go back to what you said before about being there for the evolution of the industry, it's so interesting because you're totally right that when I started in advertising, it was like 2000, right? So 20 years ago, basically. And I was in Australia, and I remember at that moment, I was part of this digital team, and they didn't know what digital was. But if you think about it, like in 2000, digital was basically email marketing and websites, right? We didn't have Facebook, we didn't have Twitter, we didn't even have blogs. Blogs even started a couple years after that, really, except for a few super geeks. And so because of that, we had all of these really interesting questions that seem so stupid now. Like, for example, we had this digital team, and we went into the ad agency, and they said, we don't know where to put you. Like, digital shouldn't be its own thing. It should be part, but we can't put you with the print advertising guys. We can't put you with the the people who are doing above the line stuff. So they ended up sticking us with the direct mail people because they're like, you do email marketing, that's sort of direct mail. And then you've got direct mail, and they called that whole, and Leo Burnett, they called that whole thing iLeo. That's how it started. And iLeo took these old school, generally older direct marketers who'd been doing it for 30 years with direct response and stuck them together with all these like 20 somethings who were building websites and using Flash and HTML. And you can imagine what happened, right? Like it just was like, what are you guys doing over here? And what are these guys doing over here? And it was just this crazy world. And that I think taught me a lot because it was all of these simultaneous challenges. Like you've got this entirely new field, you're thinking differently. Everyone is like, digital's the wave of the future. But at the same time, like we were doing like crazy, stupid shit. I mean, this was still the time when you could take all the keywords that you wanted to SEO for your website and you would make them in white and stick them at the bottom of the website because people wouldn't see it, but Google would see it. Like we were doing all the like hacking stuff because like this was the early days. And what I learned from that was just this constant evolution, like constantly trying a new thing, constantly doing something else. I mean, in 2004, I started blogging. That was super early for blogging, and I benefited from doing that. And so like that constant thing sort of led me to what I ended up doing with Non-Obvious. And to answer your question, my definition of what a non-obvious trend is a curated observation of the accelerating present. And the important part of that is the accelerating present, because what I'm really doing and what I'm teaching people how to do is to pay attention to the present. And pay so much attention to the present that you literally see things that other people walk right by and don't notice. Because if you can do that, then you can start to put those pieces together and say, this one thing, this one innovator, or this one company, or this one little story happening over here, 2 years from now, everyone's going to be doing the same thing. So it's not predicting something that's not happening, right? It's predicting that something that's happening that's small will get much bigger. That's the prediction.
So I have to ask, and before this, I have to say I felt represented. Like you, I started like in the old days. No, my first agency was Wunderman, and basically I remember the guys at Y&R would tell us like, oh, so you're the guys who just do the small letters and you send out the small letters out there, no? And we were managing the Ford Motor Company account and got to do the first website in Latin America for Ford. Like it was like very early, and we used to manage the whole database for Ford and actually the customer care center as well for Ford, right inside Wunderman. Like they was that old. Right? Yeah. And one of the things that we got to do a lot because we were in relationship marketing and because we had to manage the whole CRM for Ford, we got to learn to make decisions based on data and not just inspiration. So the creative teams at Wunderman had this training that it was not only about, getting ideas and finding some insights out of inspiration, out of thin air, but really going through the data, really, digging and understanding. And that's an amazing training. I think those are amazing skills to have right now. And a lot of people in the industry don't necessarily have that benefit of having these, 20 something years of experience going through that. And that helps you find out about those trends, right? So I have to ask, that experience that you have going through, coming from that background, working with iLeo, did that help?
Yeah, it definitely helped. I mean, on so many levels. I mean, you're talking about the data and the analytics piece, which is interesting, but I think also a lot of people totally it's corrupted the way that we see the value of marketing and advertising too, because as soon as you get into the digital world, it's like everything can be super measured, right? Like you can measure how much time somebody spent somewhere, where their mouse moved sometimes, depending on what your tracking is, like what they clicked on, what they didn't click on, versus a TV ad, which has almost zero tracking. It just has anecdotal, like, oh, how many people do we think had a TV on somewhere while, we watched it? And for a long time, people in digital would get super frustrated because their budgets would be so much lower, and the guys who were doing the TV ads would have a much larger budget, even though they had almost no accountability compared to digital. And I think the problem that caused was, first of all, there was a lot of like resentment back and forth. But more importantly, it skewed how we think about the value of digital at all. Because a lot of times what would happen is people would say, oh, if somebody didn't click on the ad, there was no value. And yet, if you watch that same ad on TV, there's no way to click on it, but people know there is some value in terms of recall, subconscious, remembering of whatever the message is. I mean, there's many reasons why having that sort of brand exposure might, over time, especially for a long lead, large purchase like buying a car, for example, you mentioned Ford, there's many reasons why that might actually benefit you. So I think that we got into this skewed idea, which continues today, of if they didn't click on it, if we didn't get that email address subscription, it was worthless. And I think that's wrong. That's totally wrong. And so part of it is just us trying to get a little smarter about that. But for me, learning that model and being in that industry through kind of most of my career has taught me not only about how that works and how to measure whether something actually has value, but more importantly, like about human behavior. Because at the end of the day, like great marketing and advertising is about telling powerful, persuasive stories. And the only way you can do that is if you understand people, what motivates people. And that's basically psychology. I mean, it's why the movement towards behavioral economics and behavioral psychology has been so huge in the world of marketing and advertising, because the people who understand that, who understand human brains and why we do the things we do, can create more compelling and persuasive messages to influence that. And that's a link that over the last 10, 15 years has become huge. But before that, like that wasn't real. Those were two separate fields, right? Mm-hmm. You would maybe have like a focus group and stuff like that, but like behavioral psychology was over here and advertising was a totally separate thing. And now those lines are really starting to blur, which I love, because what it means is in order to be successful, we have to understand people.
Absolutely. Now, going back to the work that you're doing with the Non-Obvious company and the Non-Obvious trends, and precisely doing, and I want to use the tie-in with behavioral psychology. Like, how does that work? Like, you get to see, you mentioned like you get to see some trends that might be small today, but because of the trajectory that you can see, you know that they might be huge over time, right? Yeah. So, can you share some examples of that, and where does precisely behavioral psychology fits with these two?
Yeah, let me share a perfect example. So it was several years ago, I was starting to see more and more stories of supermarkets in the UK and a couple of other places trying very unusual things as part of their experience. So for example, one of the unusual things was Tesco, I believe it was, in the UK, launched the slow checkout line. So the opposite of the kiosk where you scan your own stuff and you look at yourself and you don't talk to anybody, the exact opposite of that. There would be a person there. You would talk to the person. That person would kind of take the stuff from you. You'd have a conversation. They'd put it in the bag. You'd pay them. And then you'd walk out. And it was marketed as the slow checkout line. And it was created in partnership with the Alzheimer's Association of the UK, because there's some people who the kiosk is just not a good solution for them. It causes panic. They're not used to it. They have to, and then everybody else behind them kind of gets held up, and it's a high stress situation for some people. And when I saw that example, I did not write, the trend is going to be that every retail location will have a slow checkout line, right? That's not the point. The point is there's an underlying behavior that is speaking to, and it is empathy. And wanting to have empathy in the retail experience for people who are unlike your other consumers. And what an amazing way to show empathy by creating a slow checkout line for the people who need it most. And the story went viral justifiably, but the underlying trend that I wrote about there was that the human, even in an automated world where more and more things are automated and we're like, okay, we have AI and we have this and we have that and everything's technology and automated, there's still a huge value to the human version, the human mode, I call it. That was the trend, the human mode. And when I saw that example and I wrote about the human mode, first, before doing that, before calling it a trend, I went out and said, well, are there other examples in other industries? Because that's one of the main criteria I look at before I call something a trend. I don't just find one example of a grocery store in the UK and then call it a global trend. I find that example and then I go to financial advisory firms like robo-advisory firms, which some people in financial services have been writing about for a long time, because if you think about it, logically, it makes sense. Why not get a robot to look at all the numbers of the markets and tell you what to invest in without emotion? That sounds great, right? No bias, no nothing.
Right.
And what financial advisory firms that use robo-advisors found was that eventually people wanted to speak to someone, an actual person. They didn't feel good about just following the robot. They wanted a person. Again, human mode, right? So like here you've got an example in a grocery store in the UK. You've got an example of a financial advisory firm in a totally different industry, same trend. That's how you start to identify that this might be a trend and not just one thing happening in one place.
I love that. You just reminded me, I'm reading Adam Grant's book, Think Again. And in it, he shares precisely an experiment that they did in a debate where they brought in this very experienced debate professional. I can't remember his name right now. And he was debating the case of whether in the UK, whether preschools should be subsidized or not. And the debate was versus a computer that had like had this artificial intelligence, very similar to IBM's AI. And basically all the arguments presented by the computer were really compelling. And the AI was debating in favor of subsidizing preschool. And he was debating against it. And this was an experiment. It was not that he didn't want it or not. It was just an experiment. He won in the end, he won the debate. And the reason why he won it was because as a human, he was able to empathize with the point of view of his contender and the audience. And the computer couldn't. The computer only could present all of the arguments, the AI, all of the arguments that the artificial intelligence had read before. I had this bulletproof set of data, but was not able to empathize. So I love that example, what you're sharing. It's great.
No, that's exactly the same thing. I mean, it's so interesting. You're right. Yeah.
It's very interesting that in this, and very also, it fills me with hope in a way, knowing that in this day and age where everything's being automated, that we are seeking. And I don't know if this is wishful thinking on my side, but it seems to me that most of us are looking for ways to, humanize things again and just be more empathetic and connect with people, especially after everything that we've gone through in the last 14 months.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are looking for that. I think the other thing that is interesting, though, is it's not one or the other, right? I mean, if you had the slow checkout line, but that was the only checkout line, you'd probably be pretty frustrated. Of course. Because sometimes you want to get in and you want to get out, right? So sometimes we do want the human mode because it's important to us to have the human connection. Sometimes we just want to go to the ATM, get our cash and leave. And if we have to talk to somebody, that's a failure of the system, right? So I think that what's important to remember is that we don't always want one thing or the other. What we need to appreciate and value if we're the ones creating the experience is, when does someone want this experience versus that one? And do we have the ability as an organization to provide both in the right moments when people want one versus the other? And people will always be different. I mean, look, there are a lot of people who over the last year have been really, really saddened because they are not able to go to live concerts. I, on the other hand, would any day of the week prefer to watch a musician performing in their house directly, acoustically, just for me, or what seems like it's just for me, right? Obviously it's not just for me, but it seems like it. I would pick that over going to a concert where people are screaming and disturbing my experience of the music any day of the week. But that's just me. Some people love the vibe of being in a live concert, and that's their thing, right? Mm-hmm. So people are different. Like, people will always choose different things based on their preferences. And so the challenge for us is to try and make their choices something that we have an option for.
Of course. Couldn't agree with you more. And yeah, I rather have that same experience at home too, by the way. So
maybe because we're old and we were there for the beginning of the internet,
Antes de continuar con este episodio, déjame platicarte que Entre Mentores DLC es presentado por Ricolto Café, una empresa 100% mexicana que desde hace 20 años ha llevado la experiencia del mejor café gourmet de México a miles de oficinas en este país. Hoy, Ricolto Café llega también hasta nuestros hogares a través de su nueva tienda en línea. Puedes conocerlo mejor y hacer tu pedido de cosecha especial de Veracruz, mi favorito, o de Chiapas en grano o molido en ricoltocafé.com.mx. Eso es Ricolto con K de kilo. Visita ya ricoltocafé.com.mx y lleva el mejor café de México hasta tu hogar con Ricolto Café.
So we were discussing at the beginning the transition that you did from going from the advertising industry into your own company and your own business, doing these keynotes, working as a public speaker, published author. You have many books already, close to, if I'm correctly, close to 10 already?
Well, you'd have
or
to.
Or over 10.
I debate, speaking of debates, I debate this with my wife all the time because my Non-Obvious book, as you know, was a 10-year series.
Right.
And every year I published a new version of it with 15 brand new trends, but the rest of the book was pretty much the same. So I count that as one book, in which case I would have 7 books. My wife says you should count that as a different book every year because you basically rewrote more than half of it. So if you do it by that, then I probably have more like 13 or 14. So,
okay. Well, it's you built a career out of that, and that's very, very interesting. And it's that's dealing with change, and change is always hard. Yeah. And change basically scares even the bravest of us. That's the nature of change, and our brain goes into this flight or fight mode, and we don't know sometimes how to deal with change, and making hard decisions in our work.
Can I just say something about that?
Please.
I don't actually entirely agree with that. I think that what a lot of times we are afraid of is not change, but risk, and risky change.
Yes.
And so for me, what I tell people a lot is what you're hesitating about is a change that feels like it's a huge risk. Quitting your job and starting your own thing, right, is a huge risk financially for most people. The question that I encourage people to ask in any situation like that is, what could I do to make this change less risky? Mm-hmm. Because when you have a situation where the change is less risky, then you're much more likely to do it, right? Because it's not a big deal. It's like, okay, I'm changing a tire, right? Or I'm like, these are also
right.
changes, right? But we don't panic about these things as much. So that's one of the things that I constantly think about, which is how do we make this change? And by the way, this is a way of doing what some management people call managing up. So managing mm-hmm. up is this idea that you're managing your boss, right? And a lot of times we have trouble getting our boss, him or her, to say yes to a risky idea that we have, especially if you're a creative agency person and trying to sell that risky idea to the client. And the only way to sell it is not to convince them that it's so creative that it's worth doing. It's to demonstrate to them that the risk of doing it is not as high as they think it is.
I love that. And how did you go about, minimizing or managing that risk in your transition?
The number one way that works almost always is to contrast it with the risk of doing the opposite. So for example, if you come up with an amazing campaign and they say, oh, it sounds too risky, the way to sell that would be to say, look, your competitor over here is running an amazing campaign. If you don't do this breakout thing, they're going to take your 10% market share and they're going to send you to 4% market share. So your risk of not doing this campaign is way worse than your risk of doing the campaign, for example, right? So like that is one way to kind of to sell it. The other is to just play it out as a scenario, right? And so say, for example, you're doing something on an internal network. Like, what's the worst thing that's going to happen is one of the questions you could ask. And when people play out the worst thing that could happen, sometimes it's actually not that bad.
Yeah, often it isn't. You're right. You're completely right. But let me ask you this. I have to agree with you. We have to learn to minimize risk and manage it in a way. No, if it's possible, we can try to manage it in a way. And for a transition like going, I'm going through a very similar phase right now where I left my corporate career and started doing something on my own. No, and it's an important change. And I did like a 5-year plan to transition, and that was working on personal finances, but also working at a psychological level too, because it's in a transition. So there's some changes that we can learn to manage and minimize risk, but then sometimes there are other risks and other changes that are imposed on us, like basically a virus comes, takes over the world, puts us all in lockdown mode, and a lot of changes occur. And what changes have you gone through in the last 14 months, like this pandemic, in your line of work? I was talking to Mitch, and he was in the show a couple of months ago, and we're discussing that, and with Chris as well, suddenly, like all public speaking, it was like down to zero.
Yeah.
So how did you adapt?
So just to give you a sense of the scale of it, right? I mean, I was looking at my revenue from 2019 to 2020, bit difference when it came to my speaking revenue. It was down 80%. So that's a huge hit, right? And for me, what really helped me manage that time and not feel desperate, right, to have to do something, was I actually have 2 businesses, which I'd been building over the last 5 years. And the one that we've talked about is the Non-Obvious company, where I go and write these books and I do all this speaking and I run workshops and, all of that. The other company has been much quieter, but has been growing much faster, which is a book publishing company called Idea Press. And what ended up happening as a result of the pandemic is I wasn't traveling at all. I wasn't doing speaking at all. So I decided to go down and start writing, because I'm a writer. And I began writing, and I wrote a book that I published all about the non-obvious. It was called The Non-Obvious Guide to Working Remotely. So it was basically about, what we're doing now, and I published that. But there were many other people who decided to do the same thing. They might have written a book in 2022, 2023. They decided, well, why not do it now? I'm already at home. I have the time. I'm not traveling. I'm not speaking. And so our publishing business started exploding with inquiries. Like more and more people said, hey, I need help with publishing my book. How are we going to do it? That business almost doubled over the last year. And the reason why it didn't triple is because we had to say no to projects, because we didn't want to grow that fast and not be able to deliver on our promises. Otherwise, we probably could have tripled it. So what I learned from that was, as an entrepreneur, doing the same thing that they tell you to do when it comes to financial advice, which is diversify. You don't want to hold all financial assets in one category, because if that goes down, you're screwed. Just like that, as an entrepreneur, you don't want to have just one revenue source, because if you're reliant entirely on, for example, in my case, public speaking, which was bringing in great revenue, but if I was 100% reliant on that, I would have really struggled over the last year. And because I wasn't, I could take this other business, and even though one business is down 80%, the other one's up 200%. And so they sort of, not 100% equal out, but like you can see the balance, right?
Right. Right. Absolutely. Really great advice. So let me ask you, with all the ups and downs, and especially what we've gone through in the last year or so, and all the ups and downs of your career, the peaks and the valleys throughout your entire career. If Dr. Brown, remember Doc Brown from Back to the Future? Sure. If Doc Brown were to show at your doorstep with the keys to the DeLorean for you, which point in time would you travel to and for what?
Well, I write about trends, so I would have to go to the future first. I would just have to because of my curiosity. Plus, I think that just time loop wise, I don't think I'd screw up things as much. If I went to the past, maybe I end up screwing up our timeline and multiverses and all that stuff. So about it. But I think if I went to the future just as an observer, maybe I wouldn't screw things up as much. And I think I would just do some future tourism. I'd go 10 years in the future, then I'd go 50, then I'd go 100, then I don't know how far I could go, right? But I just think that'd be fascinating. That's where I would go.
Rohit, writers read a lot, often. So if you could take the DeLorean back to visit yourself, maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago, what one book would you recommend your past self? Like, this is the one that the sooner that you read it, the better for you.
I would have liked to be a more confident speaker way earlier in my life. What I don't know is whether a single book, there's some great books about that, but I don't know that a single book would have taught that to me. Versus doing some other things like taking an actual class or learning from someone who is a professional about being a more professional speaker and being able to express myself more confidently. I wish I had known how to do that in my 20s as opposed to learning it later on in life. But that's not a book per se. Is that okay?
No, that's really good. That's really good. And I think that, there are some skills that the sooner and the earlier in life we learn them and integrate it into, I have this theory, I call it the theory of the virtual bat belt. Remember Batman's utility belt, where he had the batarang and all his tools? Yeah. I think that we all have this virtual belt that we have, just like a carpenter or a construction professional has these leather belts with the hammers and the screwdrivers and all the tools. We have one too. It's a virtual one that we equipped with all the skills and all the learnings that the lessons that we learn, the skills that we integrate, and we keep equipping this belt, and we just keep using these skills as we need to and actually we have to not only equip it, but we have to actually practice these skills. And some skills, the sooner that we acquire them, the better. And I think that speaking, it's one of those skills that no one really actually teaches that for when we're young. And that's something we need to, the sooner the better. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of times when we do learn it, it's only under the category of public speaking.
Right.
Which is actually not entirely what I mean. What I mean is expressing myself confidently in front of 4 people, but just being able to speak what I really mean in a way that's persuasive. That's, to me, a bigger part of it. Yes, the public speaking is a super valuable skill, and I do wish I was better at that earlier in my life. But I think the idea of expressing yourself confidently is really the skill.
Good. Love that. So we're going into the final lap of the show. So before we dive into the last set of questions, where can people connect with you?
I have a personal website, which is my full name, just rohitbarghava.com or non-obvious.com. And that has links to, we've talked about some of the things in terms of my Megatrends series, Non-Obvious guides. We also do an annual book awards program. There's a podcast on there. There's an insights show. I mean, there's lots and lots of stuff under that brand of Non-Obvious.
Perfect. Okay, good. So speaking about skills and lessons learned, some of these skills we kind of build or integrate into our life in the form of habits and routines. And I think that for a leader like yourself to be as productive as you are, you necessarily have to integrate and build a set of routines and habits that help you be as productive, like habits that help you have a high level of energy, and routines that help you have the right amount of friction and the right order in your life so that you can do all the things that you do. So what habits and routines have you built into your life in the last few years that help you be as productive as you are?
One habit I have been using for years now is blocking out times on my calendar that are not allowed to be scheduled for anything, for specific reasons. So sometimes it'll be because that's when I'm working out. Sometimes it'll be for a specific lunchtime. Sometimes it's just writing time. And I usually don't do any calls before about noon my time. Morning time is when I'm most productive to do my writing, to do my thinking, to do all of the development on different things that I need to do. So in my opinion, it's a waste of my productive time to schedule that time for phone conversations that I can be equally productive on in the afternoons, my afternoons. And so that's been a number one thing that I've done. I've blocked out times on my schedule, and I don't do any of the phone calls earlier on in the day.
Good.
Or Zoom calls, by the way, not just phone calls. Zoom calls. Also.
Yeah, of course. No, I mentioned earlier that I'm going through this transition phase, going from leading Twitter and going into my whole thing, my own thing. And one of the things that there's another podcaster in Mexico who has this auto reply in his email. Whenever you write him, you get this auto reply that says, I only read email twice a day, only at this time in the morning, at this time in the evening. So if you, depending on the time that you are emailing him, that you will not get an answer maybe until that evening or maybe the next day. And that's something that I really liked, when I met him. And that's something that I've been thinking about implementing. But back when I was at Twitter, that seemed like something not necessarily very client friendly to do when you're in an organization like that, where you have to serve like all your clients. So now, being independent, it's something that we can do, and it's something that it's just up to us to decide. But what would you recommend to those people who are still in their corporate life, how they can manage to set those times? Because you said something that's very important. You have to know at what time of the day you're more creative and more productive. And you have to safeguard that space and that time, with your life, basically. So if you really want to be as productive.
I think one of the things is we create these problems for ourselves because of the reputation we built for ourselves. So what we say publicly is, if you send me an email, I'll get back to you within 24 hours. What we feel like we have to do is, if you send me an email, I'll get back to you within 20 minutes. Right. And so that's not because the person who sent the email asked for the response in 20 minutes. That's because we felt like we had to deliver it. And the more you do that, the more people expect that. And so pretty soon what happens is 3 months down the road, everyone's like, oh, you always respond to emails within 20 minutes. And anytime you don't, they send follow-ups and say, hey, what's wrong? How come you didn't get me an answer yet? Right? Because you've trained them to expect an email back from you in 20 minutes. So there's a couple ways out of that pattern. Because part of the reason people do it is, oh, I better respond now, otherwise I'll forget. So it's not even I need to get back immediate response. It's let me just do it now because I have time now. Otherwise I might forget and then it'll be a big problem. So one thing I use constantly is I will get an email in, and if I have time right when I see it, I'll respond immediately, but I'll schedule that response to send a couple hours from now, not right away, which is easy to do on Gmail and probably other platforms as well. So what ends up happening is they get a response within a few hours or, whatever reasonable amount of time. And I did it right away. So it's off of my list of things to do, right? That's an easy way to start training people to expect those responses in a reasonable amount of time instead of immediately. Mm-hmm. It also allows you to do something with your own time, which is really valuable, which your podcaster friend doesn't have the opportunity to do, which is decide for yourself what is urgent and what isn't, right? What he's saying is nothing's urgent. I'll get back to you whenever I'm on email. What most of us have is, look, if your boss emails or if a potential client who's going to hire you and spend a lot of money with you emails, that is worth getting back to within 30 seconds. And so sometimes you do have those situations where you want to decide, okay, this is urgent. So that also helps. The other thing is I've trained my entire team to know that if I put the word urgent into a subject line, it's urgent. And I rarely do that. So when I do that, and I put urgent in the subject line, I know they're going to read it right away and they're going to respond right away. Because I have trained them to know that I don't overuse the urgent thing. It's not like CNN's breaking news where everything's breaking news and you're like, breaking news, this is like nothing. You use it very specifically. But when you do that, then the people around you are like, okay, if you say it's urgent, it actually must be urgent.
Okay. Those are really good pieces of advice. I know we have to wrap things up. Thank you very much for spending this time with us. The last question that I want to ask you is, the whole premise of this show of Entre Mentores, or Among Mentors in English, is to learn from leaders like yourself. How do you turn your day-to-day stuff into something extraordinary?
A lot of people ask me, how do you come up with non-obvious ideas? And I think non-obvious ideas are extraordinary because you're coming up with something other people aren't. One of the things that I do constantly is I take an idea that I've got or a term for something that I want to, like if I want to call a trend something, or if I want to title a post something, and I do a search for that. And if someone else has used the same title, if someone else has done the same thing, I know it's not original enough. I have to work harder. And so part of this process for me is the discipline of not only discovering something that's new to me, right, and being happy about that, but discovering something that's actually new to everybody. Because it's not enough to just say, oh, I only learned about this yesterday. I only saw this story yesterday, so it must be new. And meanwhile, we've all had that moment where somebody's like, that story came out like 3 months ago. Where have you been? Why didn't you know that, right? And so we have to challenge ourselves to really come up with something that is unique. And the more we can do that, the more you can build a reputation for yourself as someone who comes up with those types of ideas. And that's a great reputation to have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you very much for sharing that. And thank you again very much for spending this time with us. Before we say goodbye, I want to acknowledge the amazing work that you're doing. I've read most of your books. I cannot say that I've read all of them, but I've read most of them. Actually, I don't know if you remember, but I guess it was like 10 years. So Personality Included, you just published Personality Not Included. And I remember that I loved that book. And I was doing some workshops back then. And I wrote to you like, hey, I might be giving away some of these books. Remember? It's good.
Yeah, that was so interesting that time. That was 13 years ago.
Thank you, Rohit, for your time. I really enjoyed talking with you and learning from you. I look forward to seeing you again soon. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Y muchas gracias también a todos ustedes por escuchar este y todos los episodios de Entre Mentores DLC. Recuerden, este es un programa semanal, así es que si no lo han hecho ya, suscríbanse al mismo y compartan este y todos los episodios de Entre Mentores DLC, porque estoy seguro de que entre sus familiares, colegas y amigos hay muchísimas personas que se pueden beneficiar muchísimo de los consejos y lecciones que grandes líderes como hoy Rohit aquí nos están compartiendo. Muchas gracias como siempre a Ricolto Café, el mejor café de México, por acompañarme en esta aventura de vida todos los días. Yo soy Efraín Mendicuti y esto es Entre Mentores DLC. Hasta la próxima.